Hello everyone, my name's Daniel and I'm a programmer and an artist, and today I'm going to make another video about my new Petrify asset library, and it's going to be about making custom materials. So hopefully we'll be able to cover all of the the majority of the shader nodes and the texture patterns that come with the Petrify library. The first thing I want to point out is that I have included in the Petrify library this tutorial material. And if you drop that on a rock, then it will load up this tutorial material. Then you can load it up in the shader editor and read all of the notes that I left about the different nodes I used to make the basic material and my explanation for why I combined them in the way I did, what I was trying to achieve, what sort of effect I was trying to achieve by doing that, and then also in a way where you can play with the numbers and the settings. The idea was it was an interactive way you could try to learn how you could use some of the shader nodes. So I'm going to go over a lot of the same things, hopefully in this video, in video tutorial form, but just so you know, there's a tutorial material with notes in it as well, included in the asset library. The 6 preset materials are not really a great way to learn how to make a material for Petrify. You're welcome to open it up and look at them if you want, but they're sort of a mess because I was trying to make them easy to use where you could click through and get variation. There's a lot more connections between nodes than you would need to get a similar effect. So I'm going to get rid of this all and make a brand new material. All right, and then with this brand new material, I just want to go through some of the nodes and sort of show how you could build up a rock material. The key to using the shader nodes that come with the Petrify library, especially the texture sets that come with it, is to build up a lot of layers. So on their own, all of these textures aren't super detailed. They're kind of simple procedural-like patterns that all tile seamlessly. But by adding a lot of layers of them at different scales and things, you can get a lot of detail in your final material. So the first thing you're going to need, that you're probably going to want in pretty much any material, is the rock shader attributes node, because that's going to give you access to everything that's created by the attributes modifier in the stack, which is you probably want to have last in your stack. And that's going to save information about the shape of the rock and, you know, its sort of form in a 3D sense that we can then display on the shader. So angle saves the angle of the edges, basically. So the more pointy, the more of a corner you have on an edge, then it'll be more white. And if it's flat, it'll be, well, if it's flat, it will be 0, so perfectly black. And then you actually have negative values here as well. So you can run this into a map range node. And then you could map it from 0 to -1. And you can see there's actually values in those concave parts as well. So you can use, you could also map it from -1 to 1 to get like a full range. And then with that angle value, you can add things like an edge wear effect. There's actually a number of attributes that can give you that edge wear effect, or a mask for building up an edge wear effect. The curvature also does that if you have, if you turn up the number of samples. But curvature, the thing that's cool about the curvature attribute is that it should work regardless of the resolution of your geometry. So this rock here has been remeshed. If we turn on wireframe, you can see it's a pretty dense mesh. If the mesh was lower poly, even if it was remeshed, just like a lower resolution, then the angle attribute would spread further. So the sort of the size of the mask effect you get with the angle attribute depends on the resolution of the geometry, because when you have denser geometry, so if there's more points that make up a corner, then the angle between all of those points will be less, and so there's less contrast in the angle map. Whereas the curvature map is calculated by sampling in an area, a radius around the source point, and so it should be more consistent regardless of the resolution of your geometry. Obviously, at a certain point, the resolution gets low enough that the math starts to not make sense anyway. concavity is super useful. It measures the distance from a convex hole, so like a shape that wraps around the outside of the rock like this. It measures how far any given point is from that convex hole. So parts that are more concave, that cut into the rock, will be white, and parts that are on the surface of that concave shape will be more black. I find that can be a really cool way to add sort of a weathered effect to deeper, more carved out parts of the rock. So I've used concavity. I think I use concavity in basically all of the 6 preset materials. Then slope is the face of the rock pointing up towards the sky or down towards the ground, basically. So we can use that to add effects like putting dirt only on the top surfaces, or you could have it put snow only on the top, or moss only on the top, things like that. AO is sort of somewhere in between the curvature and the angle mode. If you notice, curvature doesn't have the negative values, so the concave parts aren't measured. You can't separate the concave parts from the convex angles, whereas AO is also calculated using a bunch of samples, but the samples also have that sort of concave convex attribute to them as well. So if you want to get the full range, again, you'd have to put that into a map range node and map the range from -1 to 1 to have the full range from the AO mask. And then elevation is just a quick way to get black at the very bottom and white at the very top of the rock. So that could be used to apply some effect only to the bottom half of the rock or something like that. Anyway, so those attributes are going to be super useful for placing effects that we want in certain areas on the rock. All right, so if we were going to build like an edge wear effect, we could use any of those attributes I mentioned, but let's take the curvature one, and maybe we'll add to it the ambient occlusion one as well, and we could map the range of that to be from -1 to 1. Now, we're probably a little too bright now, so we could go ahead and map the range again and maybe pull up this minimum value until we start to see some dark black areas in this. So that looks pretty good. Then we might, it might be a little too smooth, so we could add in a texture with some noise. And so you could either use the regular noise, like procedural noise texture that Blender comes with, or I have some different ones in here. In this case, let's add the fine noise to it. So the fine noise looks like this once it loads the texture here. It looks like this, and you can sort of increase the scale of that noise by changing the index. The higher the index, the more scaled up the noise is. And then there's some additional controls for the strength of it, which just multiplies it in contrast. So if we add that to our map range here, or subtract it maybe, we could subtract some noise from this, play with the contrast a bit, reduce the strength. And what we're able to do is add some extra detail into that texture that wasn't there before. So you can see this is before with just the attributes, which are sort of all blurred together between the vertices. And then by adding that noise to it, it still has the same overall detail to it from the 3D attribute, but with some extra detail added in between from the texture. So that's all great. You can see we sort of have that edge wear effect. But then we need to actually apply it to some colors. So what we might also do is take another fine noise texture and run it through a gradient map. So let's decrease the contrast on this a bit, and we can add the gradient texture. And what this has is just a bunch of different colors in it. And so by plugging something into the mapping, we can map we can map the grayscale range to a range of gradient colors, basically. And so if we click through, we can see some different variations of that. And if we increase the contrast or play with these settings, we get a different range. So something like that might be good. But then we might want to add some extra detail to it, so we could add a spot texture. And the spot texture is mostly black with just white spots, and we can adjust the scale of it to what we like. There's different variations of the pattern. So then maybe we could do a mix color node, or yeah, mix. And we could play with some different types. Soft light might work well if we added a bit to this, so it doesn't. One of the things I find can happen is you can end up with your textures getting really dark. So in this case, if we add 0.5 to the soft light, it's not going to make the black of this spot texture is not going to make it any darker, but the white will make it brighter, but in a way that's not too aggressive. It just sort of adds some detail to it, as opposed to if we had this like on add, without the adding the 0.5, you can see the, I mean, you could turn the factor down. I don't know. I just find I like the effect that soft light gives better than fiddling with an add or something like that. So that's a pretty nice kind of detailed base. We need to get some other, like some normal map and stuff in here. So let's go ahead and plug this into the principled shader. And I found that with the rocks, I typically like to turn the index of refraction down quite a bit, to like 1.1 or 1.2. I just like the effect that gives better. And then obviously we need, for now we can just turn the roughness up to like 0.95, but we'll want to plug a texture into that eventually. And then we could go ahead and put a normal map in here just to add some detail. So let's add a voronoi text, not that one, the voronoi texture, image texture one. So what this has, we have to connect it to some UV coordinates. It's a voronoi texture, but it's sort of distorted. And it has a normal map. So that is based on this distance as a height map. So normals just look nicer than doing like height to normal or something. So if we plug this in here and we turn the scale up pretty high, you can see we can get some detail across the whole surface of the rock. And then with this strength on the normal here, we can control how much of that we want to see. So we'll probably turn it down a little bit. And then this is these, so the voronoi, the slabs, the cracks all have normal outputs as well as value outputs. And you can combine them as just sort of like we did with combining some different color effects here with the soft light. We can combine normal maps and stack them up in layers as well. So we could make a copy of this voronoi texture and we could pick a different index maybe, change the scale to something bigger. Maybe we'll make the scale 1, add some like really big shapes to this. And then we could do a normal blend, or I called it normal mix, a shader normal mix node. And we just plug the two normal maps together and they both get added together. You can control this, you have to control the strength of these normal maps. Like if you wanted less of A or less of V, you control that through the strength slider on the texture as opposed to mixing them. Now we could also only add this larger detail on a certain part of it. So we could even take like this mask we made and maybe subtract it from 1 to flip it around. So 1 minus that mask would look like this. So now we have black on the corners. So if we only want to see, if we don't want to see this bigger normal map detail on the corners of the rock, we could plug that into the mask here. The mask is going to multiply B, or affect B, so that it's applied more where the mask is white and less where the mask is black. So then if we plug that into our shader here, you can see if we disconnect the mask and then connect the mask that we get a stronger effect. Well, I don't know, it's kind of hard to tell. If we change the scale on this though, let's turn the strength up to 1 and the scale to 10. Then when we connect this subtract node, you can see that right here on the corner that it gets weaker and then stronger when we disconnect it. Anyway, so that is an option on the normal mix node, but as far as the overall strength of everything, you apply that through this strength field here. So we could even just plug like a random pattern into the mask here to apply the finer detail in some areas and not others. So you could even take a third voronoi texture and look at the color of it. And if you separate the color of the voronoi noise, you actually get this pattern, but they're X, Y, and Z are each more and more blurred. So X isn't blurred at all, Y is blurred a little bit, and then Z is blurred quite a bit. So then we could plug Z of this pattern into the mask, and we'd apply this finer noise texture here, which might start to look like it's tiling because it's so repetitive. We can apply it at different strengths across the surface of the rock based on the colors of this pattern here. So let's turn the scale on that down to something. There we go. So then the effect without the mask, you can see it's even everywhere. And then with the mask, just adds a little more variety to it. Anyway, there's really no right or wrong way to do this. It's just coming up with ideas and combining the nodes in different ways and trying to make interesting effects. But the overall goal, what you're going to want to be doing to get good results, is to add a lot of layers. Because like I said, each individual layer is pretty simple. So another texture we have is slabs. So the slabs texture also has a normal map. So if we wanted to add another layer of detail to this, we could copy our normal mix here. And we need our UV coordinates for our slabs. Now the slabs, if we scale this up, you can see it creates these striped patterns. And the way this unwrapped was actually kind of weird. Because this went on the bottom, around to the bottom, I guess. Anyway, the UV unwrap node is supposed to make all of these stripe patterns run the same direction. So you can see they're all pretty horizontal right now, except for this weird end that is broken. But slabs can make the seams more visible. When you add a lot of layers, the UV seams sort of disappear, is what I found. But the slabs can make them more visible just because of the higher contrast in the bigger pattern. Anyway, let's add a bit of this in here just for fun. And you can see that seam that was so visible when you looked at the color is hard to tell. It's right here, but it's a lot less visible when it's just the normal map. So we could scale that a bit if we wanted. Actually, I think that's pretty good. But maybe what we could do that would be kind of cool, because then we could get another attribute in here, is we could apply it only to the sides of the rock. So we could take our slope attribute here and run that into a map range, which this runs from +1 on the top to -1 on the bottom. So if we do from -1 to 1, we'll have from black where it's pointing straight down to white where it's pointing straight up. And then if we run that through a float curve, then we can have both the top and the bottom be black. And we can sort of control how this falls off by pulling these in. That's probably pretty good. Something like that. And then we could plug this into the factor for our normal mix node. And then if we go back to our shader, we can see that the slabs texture here is only being applied on the sides and not on the top of the rock. So let's set the strength back to like 1.5 maybe. Now we could even take this value that matches the texture from the normal map, and we could apply it to the color to sort of see it a little bit better. So maybe we just take the soft light and plug it right in and see what that does. That's kind of cool. You can really see the sort of strata kind of effect. Now we do have to be careful because it's going to make our seams more visible. Hang on, I'm gonna try to fix this UV map. All right, I tweaked the UV map so that that one end is textured better. I just ended up decreasing the edge angle a bit and increasing the minimum face area a bit. Anyway, so what I was trying to do was make this sort of strata effect more visible, but just like with the normal map, we don't want it to apply to the top. So we can go ahead and take that same mask that we used right here, and we can use that as the factor on the color as well, so that those stripe effects are only applied on the sides. And then we probably want to go ahead and run that into a multiply as well, so that we can tone it down a bit. We could either do that in the factor, or we could edit the color itself. So maybe like 0.75 is a good value there. So that's pretty cool. Then let's go ahead and try to apply that edge effect that we had. So we will take this value here and maybe just run it into a soft light as well. Or we could put it in the factor, and then we can make this color as bright as we want. So we can see that that doesn't have too strong effects, so let's go ahead and run that into a multiply. And we can multiply this by like 3, an unchecked clamp factor, so that we can apply that. And now we can make the edges as bright as we want. We can also run it through a power node, which can allow us to increase the contrast of it, essentially. So you can see if we multiplied it by 2 maybe would be better. Then we can use this power node to really highlight just the edges. So let's see what sort of effect that has. Now it's looking kind of bright. So we should do something to tone the whole thing down a bit. So maybe we'll do a multiply now, and we could just darken the whole thing a bit, or we could plug a texture into that. The other texture we have, the final texture, is cracks, and it can be really good to add some extra detail in there. It's also has normal map output, so we can mix it in there. And it also has 3 different color outputs that get sort of increasingly distorted. So you can stack all of those on top of each other if you want, or you can just pick whichever one you like best. Use them as masks for adding color. So let's add another multiply in here and take cracks B, and we'll darken the cracks. And then it's also affecting the normal map at the same time. So then we can just adjust the scale to something we like. We could put a mask in there too if we only wanted to apply it to randomly to certain parts of the rock. And we also have different variations we can choose here. So let's just leave that one on 1. I kind of like that. And then we'll go ahead and add another one here. Just stack these in. Let's do crack C this time, just so it's a little bit different. We'll change to a different variation. And we're going to scale this one up to like 3 times, or 4 times. And let's plug this into the factor, not the color. Let's really scale this one up, and then we'll turn the strength down, which affects the normal map on these smaller cracks. That can get you some nice crack kind of details in there. There's lots of different, there's 8 different variations on all of these textures. So slabs, you can click through and change to get different variations. Cracks, the voronoi ones, all of these have 8 different variations. I think that's pretty much, I mean, you can keep going forever. We need a roughness map in here, so let's, maybe we'll take this one. I feel like this could be pretty good as a roughness map. And then we'll just add to that some fine noise. Let's do fine noise 8, and we'll scale it up to like 3 times. One thing I should mention about all of these textures, because of sort of a technical limitation for how I had to do them, they all use closest point sampling. So if you get close enough, you start to see the pixels. I don't think it's really a problem if you, as long as you pick the right scale for the texture, then those, you know, you don't see those pixels because they're smaller than a rendered pixel. But just so you're aware, you can't make your scale of your texture like 0.01 or wherever. If you make the scale of your texture like 0.1 or something, you're going to kind of see those pixels pretty easily because they're going to be a lot bigger on the surface of the rock. So now when we add those together, we're a little too bright. Everything's greater than 1, so we'll just multiply everything and see what that does. So we want this pretty, rocks are pretty rough unless they're wet, so we don't really want them to be too shiny. The best way to see if something, well, I don't know if it's the best way. The way I usually like to see if I like this, how reflective something is, the specular levels, is to go around to the shadowed side of the rock so that the shadow, we're looking at the rock, we're looking towards the light basically, and then adjust the angle so that the light becomes more and more in view, and you can see we're not really getting any shine here. So you can see as the camera gets more and more aligned with, you know, the angle of the sun where it would bounce directly into the camera, you get a good sense of how shiny the rock is. So I think something like that's probably pretty good. So anyway, I think that's about all I wanted to cover. I suppose I should mention the other nodes just so that I cover those. Add dirt and add moss are sort of quick shortcut effects that you can add. So once you have your rock basically done, if you want to be able to, so once you have your rock basically done, if you want to just add a quick effect to it, to add some extra detail, you can drop the rock in here and then run your normal map also through it like this. Oops, I lost the normal. And then this will just add some dirt on the rock. It'll try to collect in crevices on the top flatter surfaces of the rock. So you can adjust the strength of that as well as how like faded in or out it is with the blend. And then you can adjust the color of it. If you want blue dirt, you can do that. And then after the dirt shader, there's the moss shader. You can add it as well. It works in exactly the same way, except it adds kind of a moss effect. So that looks sort of like this. Again, it's a little bit different. The controls on it, there's just one color control, and then it varies the hue and saturation of that slightly. And then it has controls for how much the normal is based on the geometry normal or the normal map. There's the threshold is how upward facing the normal has to be to get moss on it basically. So set it to 0, nothing's getting moss. As you turn that up, the top's got moss, and then now the sides have moss as well. You can probably turn it up to like 2 if you want moss on the bottom, but you'll have to manually type that in. Anyway, so those are sort of quick effects if you want to toss those on to add some extra layers of detail. If you want to just control the overall strength of the normal map, there is this normal strength node. You just pop that in at the end or at whatever point you want to control the strength of the normal map, and then you can scale it to make the normal effect stronger or less. You can use that in any setup, doesn't have to just be the Petrify one, obviously. And then the final node is a special strange one called Blend Shader, and it is not to be used on a rock material itself, but if you, one of the nodes, the modifiers that you can add is the ground blend, and it creates a strip of geometry going around the rock sort of like this, and you would put this blend shader on that material, the material that was on that blend geometry, to sort of have it fade out as it approached the rock. Anyway, hopefully that's given you some ideas about how you can use all of the nodes that come in the Petrify library that have to do with shading and textures and stuff like that. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you're interested in purchasing Petrify, you can do that on Blender Market, which is soon to be called Superhive, or on Gumroad. If you want to know more about all of the modifiers and the nodes and the materials and preset rocks and all of that that comes in the Petrify library, as well as a number of sort of written tutorials where I show step-by-step my thought process for making 3 different showcase images, you can go over there, see those, see how I made them, see what all of the tools are on my website. There's a link for all of those things in the description. There is also a link to my Discord server, which you're welcome to join. If you have any questions, I'm always in there answering questions that people have, so I'd be happy to do that. And yeah, I think that's all I've got for this one, so thanks for watching.